Congressman, thanks for joining us. Delighted to have you here on Tariff Day. As Annie said, could not be better timing. I want to jump right in. We have some tariffs taking effect. We have the North American tariffs still sort of in train, but delayed for a month for now. And so my first question is, what is Congress's role here?
Well, obviously the new administration, as outlined even before the election, wanted to move on some tariffs. And so these, I think, are to be expected. Now, what we've seen over the last few days, Canada and Mexico responded with, I would say, a posture of cooperation. And I think that's a step in the right direction. And I've long said I'm not a huge fan of tariffs. I do understand they need to be a tool in the toolbox, and I think we need to, come to terms with the fact that President Trump is going to use those tools. And this is after 4 years where it was really unclear what our trade policy was, even though the previous Trump administration was very active, very vigorous in terms of a trade agenda and actually bringing people together, and that led to USMCA and I think one of the most bipartisan trade agreements probably in history.
Yeah, you mentioned that you've not historically been a big fan of tariffs, which is true of a lot of people in your party, and we didn't really see much public pushback from Republicans in Congress to what we've seen over the last few days. Why is that?
Well, it's all still very fresh as well, and I think looking at what the response has been from Canada and Mexico shows that we'll hope for a negotiation, ultimately cooperation by our trading partners, and move forward from there, hopefully in a productive way.
So, during Trump's brief spat with Colombia, there was talk of potentially legislation to back up those tariffs. Do you expect Congress to actually legislate on tariffs, whether it's it reinforcing some of these one-off actions or something a little bit more formalized?
Well, I don't expect Congress to ultimately have the votes to just grab everything back. And I think, however, watching the administration and hearing from the administration on a vigorous trade agenda, I think it can lead to some positive results. We saw that last time. And I say that, again, not as a huge fan of tariffs, but a vigorous trade agenda from the previous Trump administration led to USMCA, led to a preparation of a trade agreement with Kenya, for example, that was pretty much ready to go, and then nothing was done by the Biden administration. In fact, the Biden administration said, well, we'll talk to Kenya, but not about tariffs, even though Kenya is already an AGOA country with tariff relief. I'm still bewildered by the fact that so little was done, but even more specifically, that we didn't engage more with Kenya on a continent that I think provides huge promise for what our needs are economically, what the opportunities can be across the continent of Africa, and then we aren't as dependent perhaps on some of our other trade partners as we have become.
Yeah, and in terms of opportunities, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's much talk of expanding our exports right now. And, Nebraska, your district,
sure.
Agricultural trade is a key component. So would you like to see more of a focus on that? Or, just to sort of extend this out, right? Like the trade war, a lot of the way this might play out is just retaliation on U.S. agricultural exports. We might be going the other direction. So
that's a concern. Certainly it is. And, former committee chairman Kevin Brady was always quick to say, in response to questions about buy American, he said very appropriately, let's make sure that we can sell American. Now that's important to my district, obviously, a huge agriculture district. But I also think that our engagement in the world that has been lacking so much, other countries expect more of us. I mean, you look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, I've nicknamed that IPUF, because it was such a light touch when other countries were expecting more out of the United States of America. And they weren't seeing it. And now we have a new administration, and clearly President Trump has higher expectations of our trading partners. And I think they're taking this very seriously. And a vigorous trade agenda, I think, can end up helping our country, helping elevate our engagement around the world.
Do you worry that some of these actions will make it harder for the U.S. to reach new trade agreements? Because, for example, the tariffs that he's threatened on Canada and Mexico would essentially blow up USMCA. And so, the question becomes, well, why negotiate a trade deal if the president might go after those countries for drug trade stuff?
Well, when you look at what USMCA did, Trump, that was, I like to remind folks that was a Trump priority amidst a Pelosi speakership, and it got done. If that can get done, pretty much anything can get done. But, it extended into a new administration. And I'm glad we had that when I see that Mexico attempted to shut out our biotech corn, for example. Now, naturally, I would probably be concerned about that because of my district being the #1 producer of that product, but it was such a flagrant violation from Mexico of the trade agreement, and that took about 4 years to finally get worked out. Sadly, President Biden had nothing to say about it ever. But it's not about a lot of these trade interactions and trade agreements aren't about just the short term. It's more about the long term and how the world views us as engaging. And obviously, they want access to our markets, #1 market in the world. And we've tended to give other countries more access to our markets than they've been willing to give us access to theirs. And President Trump is drawing more attention to that. I think that's a fair analysis. There can be a variety of responses of how we should move forward. Clearly, the American people elected President Trump pretty strongly, and I think moving forward, other countries are expecting us to be more aggressive, and they're seeing that.
Just on principle, do you think that countries that have free trade agreements with the U.S. should be excluded from some kind of universal tariff?
I think, I would be interested in that, but again, the details and, fact of the matter is USMCA is a little bit different than other trade agreements as well, just as an example. And so there's some updating to do, and that's why I think engagement and really elevating the trade discussions are what are so important and what were so lacking 4 years prior. That obviously President Trump's approach is a little bit of a shock to the system because so little had happened. And I think we're seeing differences now moving forward, and we need to be ready for even more discussions moving forward.
On China, Treasury Secretary Besson has talked about how China hasn't lived up to some of its obligations in terms of ag purchases. Is that something that you've talked to him about or anyone else in the administration?
Well, that is a huge concern that, a previous Trump administration had China phase 1, phase 2. Those numbers weren't met, even though those commitments were made. So that'll get more discussion here moving forward, probably quite a bit even today.
Do you support this latest round of 10% tariffs on China?
Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of tariffs, but I understand they need to be a tool in the toolbox. And we've seen an unlevel playing field. And so I certainly respect the president for his position moving forward with this. I think elevating the discussions that need to be had. Just ignoring them does not make an unlevel playing field go away. And there's a lot of room for improvement, and so I want to keep an open mind in terms of how best to approach that. And ultimately, I want to be careful that we're not going to see huge increases in costs to consumers. That can hurt us economically as well.
Yeah, well, and just on China specifically, I mean, I know you've said that you're not a big fan of tariffs, but do you feel like China is different, where maybe these tariffs feel a little different than some of the other countries because they have, various forms of trade barriers?
Well, every country is going to offer a little different dynamic on trade, whether it's geographically or philosophically or technologically. So naturally, the White House has indicated that it's different as well, just in the difference of the numbers of the 10% compared to the 25%.
So, let's talk about retaliation a little bit. China has rolled out some retaliation this morning. It seems a little bit targeted. But if these trade wars expand, we could see a lot more retaliation. We saw Canada had a bunch of agricultural products that were on there. So do you expect Congress to top up some of these funds for, making farmers whole or partially whole for some of this retaliation?
Well, I think that we want to keep our options open there. Hearing from producers, they really prefer to produce for a market and not just looking for payments. And so whatever might be done, I hope is very temporary in need and temporary in its overall application.
But, to some extent, the president is just moving ahead with these tariffs, right? And so you kind of might just have to, I guess Congress could respond, but you could just take it as an input. If retaliation's coming, retaliation's coming. And so, I guess, do you support being prepared in that situation?
We do need to be prepared, and so we want to be effective in our approach. And like I said, I think folks across the economy have been preparing for these moments too. There's a little tension out there, certainly, but I think it's healthy that we are engaging in a way that elevates the expectations. And I think ultimately, I think our trading partners expect this as well. And of course, they don't like the tariffs. I get it, but elevated engagement is what has been missing, and we're now entering a new phase.
But if you were to add some of that retaliation, that also, or funds in response to retaliation, that also costs more money at a time when Republicans are also looking to cut taxes. So, is that a concern? How worried are you about the debt effects of the Republican agenda right now?
That's a major component of the discussion we're having as we speak, in terms of seeing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a lot of that about to expire, and the need to extend that or make it permanent. So we're having obviously vigorous discussions on how best to treat those numbers moving forward, and how we can look at the fiscal matters facing our country. Now some would suggest letting everything expire just helps our economy and our debts across the board. I doubt that to be the case. So we need to with a fine-tooth comb, look at the spending side, look for savings there, look at the tax side of what has been most productive, reversing the trend of inversions, for example. That doesn't get as much discussion as I believe it should. When you look at the many inversions that were taking place before TCJA, but not after. And so it's interesting to hear critics of TCJA describe it in a way that it's just not very accurate. But we are more competitive as a country because of TCJA, whether it's the corporate rate, whether it's R&D leading to an environment of innovation, and ultimately, post-TCJA, revenues were up. That is often not reflected on by critics as well.
But policy is all about trade-offs, right? And you've mentioned multiple times that you're not the biggest fan of tariffs. But I guess, do you support having a lower income tax but higher tariffs if that's the trade-off you have to make?
Well, I'm uneasy with that clearly, but when you look, and I tell people that the tariffs, the most successful tariff was one that doesn't generate any revenue. But is being a tool to say, hey, let's level the playing field here, can be very effective. I'm also very clear in saying I don't want to become dependent on tariff revenue, because that speaks to the fact that it's just another tax. So we want to be aggressive and effective with the application of tariffs and moving forward, and ultimately level that playing field.
And you were just extolling the virtues of the TCJA, which it seems like at least part of that is to spur productive business investment.
Right.
Are you worried that this trade uncertainty generally, whether there are tariffs or not, there's sort of this sort of Damocles hanging over the situation of whether or not we're going to have more tariffs? Do you worry that that's going to stymie business investment and slow the economy?
Oh, there's that potential moving forward, but I also think the urgency of getting this worked out is a major dynamic that brings folks ultimately together to arrive at an agreement, and hopefully, in this case that we've been reading about over the last few days, that brings about more cooperation from our trading partners, whether it's fentanyl or other areas as well.
Are you hearing from businesses? I mean, what have you been hearing in the last few days from people in your district as people sort of digest the fact that we might have tariffs on our biggest trading partners?
I heard from a manufacturer who said they need zinc in their product, and the only place to get it is Canada. Now, this dynamic was very similar during the previous Trump administration. The exclusion process was vigorous, and I think and I hope that we can move forward in a similar way this time, if necessary. But we need to be mindful of, what it does to our domestic manufacturers if the only place to get, in this case, zinc is from Canada. I doubt that it's very feasible to find a domestic, stand up a domestic source of zinc in a timely fashion. So let's deal with the realities that exist, and ultimately, though, have the expectation, the higher expectation of our trading partners to engage in a substantive and effective way.
Do you think that the administration is sensitive to these types of concerns?
I do believe they are. Looking back at the previous Trump administration, they showed that they were sensitive to the various concerns that domestic manufacturers had on their inputs. So, yes.
So I do want to talk about, you're the head of the Trade Subcommittee. What's on your agenda? What do you want to get done?
Well, looking at the review process coming up for USMCA, I think we want to get a good start on that to reflect on what needs to take place moving forward. Like I said, we just came off of the dispute resolution panel that was formed in response to Mexico shutting out our corn. But one thing I've really come to appreciate working on trade issues is the fact that the world is watching. The world is watching, what is our response, for example, to Mexico shutting out our corn. The world was watching when all sorts of folks said USMCA, NAFTA could never be renegotiated, and yet it was a priority, and it got done. Got done in a bipartisan fashion. And it was my hope, 4 years ago about now, that the success of USMCA passing in such a bipartisan fashion would actually tee up the opportunity to use a similar framework with other potential trade agreements around the world, and just did not happen. So I think we've learned a lot over the last 4 years, call it 8 years. And moving forward, I think all of that is very instructive for us to take away, look at that data and that cooperation. And the world is changing a lot every day. So we need to be mindful of how we can modernize our policies, even though, for example, USMCA, yes, seemed to be an agreeable framework. Times are different now, perhaps. Let's see what else needs to be changed moving forward. And I just see more engagement, a higher level of engagement. And I point back to early Trump administration before, when even in a district like mine, the issue of trade was becoming more negative than it should have been. And so President Trump then elevating the discussions on trade actually elevated the discussions across districts like mine, and I think across America, for a more accurate discussion of what trade policy is, what it can do, what it can't do, even what tariffs are, what they're not. And moving forward, I just think that an elevated engagement, as we are now seeing, can be healthy. And certainly we want to be wise about all of this, but also our trading partners have expected this, And I think they expected more out of us over the last 4 years as well, and they didn't get it, so times are different.
Do you have any thoughts at this juncture as to USMCA, how that might be improved?
Well, we'll go through that process. I think that, looking at what Mexico tried with shutting out our biotech corn, of course, we won, 7 points of that case, all 7 points we prevailed on. And so I'm wanting to learn more why they thought that would be acceptable. And because it kind of undermines, and I'm concerned that so little response, well, actually no response from President Biden himself. Again, the world saw that, or failed to see a response from President Biden when he could have said something in his own style. I would respect that, and as I've told people, he didn't even need to stand in front of corn stalks in a field to send the message that what Mexico had done, or was about to do for a lot of the term, was wrong, and it undermines all of rules-based trade. Let's be very clear in working together to develop an appreciation for rules-based trade and what that means, so that enforcement is workable and understandable, and that we don't just constantly have to be in a state of dispute because a rules-based trade can deliver more, as it has tended to do over time, but also to set out a clear path for resolution when necessary.
Well, speaking of rules-based trade, what about the World Trade Organization? Is that sort of a non-factor now? Do we still care about the WTO?
Its operation and structure as a consensus-based body, I don't see it being as relevant as I would like it to be, and ultimately what it was intended to be. You look at how we allowed the TRIPS waiver to take place, that didn't move the needle on public health. I fail to understand why that seemed to be such a high priority of the Biden administration, that we would give away intellectual property from our country. And there was not the capacity to produce the vaccines. I mean, the fact that we would say, hey, it's okay, we're going to allow other countries to have access to this intellectual property with the vaccines. Well, the intellectual property, yes, that's valuable, but so is the production capacity and the application capacity as well, to actually roll out and distribute all those vaccines. And so I think there's a lot to learn over the last few years, and I want to apply that moving forward.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. That's all the time we have.